Spring Academy Edition 4, Spaces of Crisis, and welcome to the public to this public keynote lecture in the context of our Spring Academy 2021. Let me briefly introduce our first keynote speaker, Dennis Dijkzeul. Dennis studied economics at the Free University of Amsterdam and earned his doctoral degree at the Ruhr-Universität at the Rotterdam School of Management. From 2002 to 2009, he was the first professor of the management of humanitarian crisis at a German university, at the Ruhr-Universität in Bochum. From 2009 onwards, he acts as full professor of public law and international law, and he is head of the Institute for International Law and Armed Conflict at the Ruhr-Universität Bochum. Dennis is a dedicated expert of international relations, international organizations, non-governmental organizations, armed conflicts, and humanitarian crisis. He co-edited a German handbook on humanitarian crisis, and he contributed key publications to this topic. Apart from being an excellent researcher and enthusiastic university lecturer, Dennis is a highly reputable advisor in the field of humanitarian crisis. He was part of the working groups designing the humanitarian programs of the United Nations in Geneva and New York. In Congo, he was working with the International Rescue Committee. He has been a member of the UN Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, in the advisory group for the Policy and Studies series in New York from 2011 to 2013. He was member of the reference group of the IOB evaluation of the Dutch humanitarian policy for the Dutch Foreign Ministry in The Hague, Netherlands from 2014 to 2015. So he regularly consults for international organizations in Africa, Asia, Central America, Europe, and the United States. So for Dennis, crisis is not only an abstract research topic, but really also something very practical. He does not only study it from the desk, but is always in the middle of crisis management, so to say. Before we get started, two short notes. This lecture will be recorded in order to be posted later on the IRS website as a YouTube video. But the participants of the webinar are invisible, so this should not be an issue for you. The lecture will take around 45 minutes. There will be time for discussion, but the participants are muted, so you have to use the Q&A function to post your questions, and then I will moderate between the questions and the speaker. The title of the keynote is the Normalisation of Crisis, so a very paradox thing, and I'm really curious to hear about it. So Dennis, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Oliver, for your kind words, for the introduction. By the way, I'm not an international law professor, even though I'm working at an international law institute. I do indeed more the social science approach to humanitarian crisis. And it's funny, you've actually already mentioned one of the conclusions that I'm going to mention, and that is that it's important to go out into the field and to understand crisis, humanitarian crisis. Yeah, and when I was preparing my lecture, I thought, I want to talk about the normalization of crisis, and originally I thought normalization of crisis, normalizing crisis, and then I realized I should not talk about crisis, I should talk in the plural about crises. So I changed my title a little to normalizing crisis, from normalizing crisis to normalizing crises, the plural. Okay, but before I get started, and of course we cannot talk easily in this format, I have two questions for you. Please write down for yourself, just in a word, a word or two, what do you consider the opposite of a crisis? That's one. And the other can be simple, yes or no. Are crises becoming more common nowadays? So think about, what is the opposite of a crisis And are crises becoming more common? What we normally think about, and I certainly do so in my field, is that I think when we think about the humanitarian crisis, we think, for example, people in a refugee camp, as here in South Sudan. South Sudan is one of the countries where I do a lot of my field work. Of course, with COVID, that's more difficult. But at the moment, I'm carrying out a remote evaluation on food security. Here, people waiting, South Sudanese refugees, waiting to get into Uganda to receive aid. And you can see the T-shirt of the woman here, which is from the International Rescue Committee, an American NGO. And it has this, as these T-shirts often have, or these polo shirts, educate a girl, educate a nation. Another example of things that we normally think about when we think about crisis here, Kosovar refugees, and these are, under the circumstances, the lucky ones. They don't have to walk. They're getting a lift in a lorry. Now, to come back to our two questions. What is the opposite of a crisis? Well, one way of talking about it is it's the opposite. A crisis is the opposite of normality. And many ideas or many disciplines have ideas in statistics about what's considered normal, or the social sciences. There are also other metaphors. For example, order. Order is, of course, a spatial metaphor, and it fits well with spaces of crisis. I will be dealing more with normality and what's normal. Additional opposites of crisis could be health, as it's often used in medicine, psychology, public health, or even boredom. But as I just said, I will mainly focus on normality. Now, are crises becoming more common? Is crisis being used in an inflationary way in our world, or are there really more crises in our age? And there is something to say, because we talk more often about protracted crisis. Somalia has had crisis since the early 90s. The Democratic Republic of the Congo, where I often work, has experienced crisis, well, almost continuously since it became independent. We also have the issue of more simultaneous crisis. I will soon give an example. Or sequential crisis. There are these statistics, and they differ somewhat, but that about 50% of the countries that experience a civil war will experience another civil war 5 years after they signed peace. So, you know, there are sequential crises. And that is important to think about, because in our society, do we have synchronous failures? Do we have problems addressing famine, illness, but also, for example, financial crisis, environmental problems? And Ulrich Beck would say, yep, that's a consequence of reflexive modernization. The solutions that we have for, say, poverty, say, in terms of economic growth, actually lead to other problems later on. So we are now causing our own crisis, and they are interacting in different manners. Now, are crises becoming more common? There is actually something to say for it empirically. Take the banking crisis from 2008. It then led to the euro crisis a bit later. There was also more malnutrition and famine in Africa. Simultaneously, we have the environmental crisis. Climate change is, of course, the biggest issue, but we also have problems with biodiversity, pollution, overpopulation. The migrant crisis, and underlying the migration crises, we've got issues such as war in Afghanistan, in Syria, humanitarian crisis in the Sahel region, poverty. At the same time, we've had Ebola, thank God not large outbreaks, mainly confined to Western Africa and the Congo. But in the Congo, there are regular outbreaks. There have also been outbreaks in Uganda, by the way. MERS, I hope that you still remember what MERS means. MERS is the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome. It's another corona disease, and it also leads to about 40% of the people who become ill die. However, the disease doesn't spread very rapidly, but it's endemic in the Arab Peninsula, so especially in Saudi Arabia, and camels, bats, and people suffer from it. And of course, we've got COVID-19. I don't have much to say about it. But we thought about crisis as an exception, and I will soon give you an example of why and how people thought of it as an exception. But if we have more crises, if they're becoming more protracted, if they are become more simultaneously, what does it actually mean that crises are a part of normality? Yeah, what does it mean for the study? And you know, many of you are studying crisis in one way or another, that crises are becoming normal. Now, I will mainly discuss humanitarian crises, but I will also refer to other crises. So what am I going to discuss in more detail? I would like to discuss how we define a crisis, then what is normalizing and normalization, and how does it take place? And this normalizing, then that will be a point that I will be making regularly. This normalizing both hides certain aspects of the crisis and highlights other aspects of the crisis. And that is not something that you just see in humanitarian crisis, but you find it in lots of disciplines. The normal curve, you know, the Gaussian curve, as you find in mathematics, particular, of course, statistics, but also in psychology and health. There, normal often refers to a lack of significant deviation or a lack of large changes from the average. The problem is who determines what the average is and who determines what the deviation is. Quite often, you will have experts, and the expert could be a humanitarian organization. In terms of financial crisis, it could be a central bank. It could be, when it's a psychological crisis, a psychiatrist or a psychologist. In health, it could be a doctor or a surgeon. Yeah, and they, in a sense, take responsibility from the person in need to address the crisis. Or perhaps I should say in humanitarian crisis, I should use the plural. They take over, and they is here the humanitarian organizations, a responsibility from the persons or the communities in need. I'm going to give you some examples how that's happening in humanitarian action, and then there are some conclusions and recommendations for research towards the end of my speech. Okay, how to define a crisis? Well, the easiest step would be, do we have some definition? Because if we have a definition, we also know what counts as a normal crisis. Well, I have to disappoint you. There is no definition of a humanitarian crisis in international law. And I will soon answer this question. Why do you think that that's the case? Why do you think that there is no definition in international humanitarian law of humanitarian crisis? There are some elements in international humanitarian law. The International Court of Justice actually described that what humanitarian action is what the International Committee of the Red Cross does. So they didn't describe the humanitarian crisis. In a sense, they shifted the definition of a humanitarian crisis to the activities and the definition of a crisis that the ICRC gives. So what's happened is, it was not that there were some objective standards of the humanitarian crisis, but there was a shift in attention to what the ICRC does. And that is very similar to what I've just told you about central bankers, surgeons, doctors, how they take over the definition and therewith part of the responsibility, and you could say definitional power of the people in need. In the Geneva Conventions, there's the common Article 3, with what defines, war, civil war, but not really humanitarian crisis. There have also been legal thinkers who thought deeply about crisis. A very notorious one, many of you will know him, is Carl Schmitt. And he was not so much writing about humanitarian action or humanitarian crisis, but he was writing about disorder and chaos. And one scholar, Finks, wrote about Carl Schmitt, "The sovereign is he who decides on the state of exception. If there is some person or institution in a given polity capable of bringing about a total suspension of the law and then to use extra legal force to normalize the situation, then that person or institution is the sovereign in that polity. Any legal order," Schmitt bluntly concludes, "is based on sovereign decision and not on a legal norm." There are 2 points, and Carl Schmitt worked closely with the Nazis. There's some discussion on how much of a Nazi he was. But at the very least, in his legal writings, he prepared the ground for a strongman, a dictator, a non-democratic head of state. But in a sense, he was also a child of his time when he wrote about exception. And this was for many years the common way of thinking about crises. The crisis is an exception. Another point that he did, whether you agree with him or disagree with him, but he emphasized the role of power, or if you want to, legal power or accepted authority. That was very important in determining what a crisis is. And also here already the shift in power comes back as an issue that we should address, that we should think about. Now, if legal aid brings up issues for us to think about, or I should say legal scholars bring up issues for us to think about, have there been some definitions of crisis? Yes, there have been. Some call them exceptional, although now I've bracketed exceptional, because if crises have become more normal, then let's forget about the exceptional for a second. But at the very least, they are an urgent situation in which actors' usual coping mechanisms do not suffice. Others, we've already spoken about them, surgeons, psychiatrists, central banks, humanitarian organizations, then need to step in. A somewhat different definition is escalating, threatening situations in which actors feel an increased pressure to act under conditions of fundamental uncertainty. I will soon, highlight some of the common characteristics in this definition. If we look at the etymology, always nice when you're trying to think about the definitions, crisis comes from the Greek word krinein, the Greek verb krinein, which means something to choose, to decide, to judge. And originally, a crisis in Old Greek meant a situation, in particular when somebody was very ill, where the situation could switch from, continuing, becoming healthy again, or dying. So a matter of life and death. A matter of health or illness, or more generally, a matter of success and failure. One of the interesting things is that the word krinein also is at the root of our word criticism. So the word crisis and criticism share the same etymological root, and you can still find it back in the word critical, which can be both providing critique, but it can also be critical, as in a critical state, in which, it could be a situation indeed of life and death or health and illness. Now, how do we define a crisis? It remains difficult to define a crisis. The definition of a crisis is often elusive because there are several aspects that interact, and I think that Oliver spoke about it earlier during his introduction, under the construction of a crisis and the performative aspects. I take voice in a slightly different way. A crisis can be a material event, so something that's happening. The experience, it's happening and people experience, could be hunger, fear, but the crisis can be an experience, and it's also a construct. Now, I'm not going to give you the one definitive definition of a crisis, because there is no definitive definition. But our brief discussion of efforts to come up with a definition show that acting in a crisis is not easy. Helping people in need can be very demanding, and there can be significant positive or negative outcomes. And it is important how the crisis is acknowledged or how it's made visible to others. Who has the definitional power? And now I'm coming to the answer of what I said earlier, why there is no definition in international law of a humanitarian crisis. You should know that international law is state-based law. States try to decide by consensus what, becomes new international law or how international law should develop. And the states didn't want a definition of a humanitarian crisis, because if they had a definition of humanitarian crisis, they probably would have to become active at the moment there's a humanitarian crisis. They therefore have, when they don't define what a humanitarian crisis is, they have more space to maneuver and also more space to neglect a crisis than if they would have defined the concept of humanitarian crisis. So definitional power, to a certain extent, also means to have the freedom to neglect a crisis, or to have the freedom to represent the crisis in such a manner that it can be neglected. Now we come back to the surgeons, the central bankers, and the humanitarian actors. There is often, by the people in need, a dependency on others to act. So also here there's a power relationship. And understanding the mechanisms by which power shifts in crisis by the people in need, or for the people in need, is really important. And this issue of exceptional and or normal is coming back quite a lot in the definitions of crisis. Please think about that. Whether you define something as exceptional or normal is just another definition. And the issue for me is not so much to come up with the right or wrong definition. The issue for me is to think through with you, to help people understand how these definitional issues play a role, for example, in humanitarian action. So there can be many changes in the definitions of crisis. Now, what is normalization? Or if we take it as a verb, what's normalizing? Normalizing literally means making normal, so that doesn't help us much. Yeah, but quite often people define normal as a lack of significant deviation from the average. And what people are really good at is that they often define the opposite of normal, which people normally don't use the word crisis, they will use the word abnormal. And that always makes me think about a poster when I was a kid in the Netherlands. And it said, have you ever met a normal person? question mark. And then the next question was, and did you like it? So the idea of defining what's normal and abnormal can also be criticized, as people try to do with this poster. Yeah, I will soon say something about the normal curve, but in psychology and health, it often refers, as I said earlier, to a lack of significant deviation or a lack of a large change from the average. But you always have this issue. So who determines the deviation? Who determines the average? Who determines what's normal? And what you then also see is that you've got different definitions in different disciplines or in different cultures over time. I will not say much about the experience, but this photograph actually won the Pulitzer Prize. It was, the picture was taken by Kevin Carter. I think he was originally from South Africa. He made many pictures. He was a well-known photographer in the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, and he later went to Sudan. This picture is from 1993. This is a girl trying to reach a health center. And I should tell you, 4 months after Kevin Carter won the Pulitzer Prize, which is, you know, a prize for quality in media reporting, he actually committed suicide. And in his farewell letter, he wrote how difficult it was for him to deal with all the wars and all the violence. What was really sad, he also got a lot of criticism on this picture, because what he did, he didn't touch the girl. He threw stones at the vulture so that the vulture left, and the girl, on her own account, on her own initiative, was able to reach the feeding center, nutrition center that was close by. The reason why he did not touch her was because he was told not to touch the children because many had diseases. And by the way, when I'm in South Sudan and when I'm in the camps, people tell me exactly the same. You know, a kid wanted to hold my hand, and then an African colleague of mine said, "Oh, be careful with holding his hands. You know, you better clean your hands now because you can see his eyes. He's got a problem with his eyes, and otherwise you may also get an eye infection." And this is, you know, being told regularly. What I would like you to get into is into the mind of Kevin Carter at this moment. He's under a lot of stress. He is in a very difficult situation. He is still able to do his work. And he also follows the advice, probably subconsciously, not to touch the child. And he thinks he's going to make it to the feeding center. And he scares the vulture to leave the child alone. Here we talk about crisis as experience. And what's normal, for example, not touching the children because of diseases, can later lead to great ethical criticism, and probably also can lead to severe self-doubt. Here is a more positive picture. These are South Sudanese refugees in northern Uganda at a vocational training course, and they are learning hairdressing. And here there are two aspects of normal that are important. Normal as something negative, that is what we saw in the last picture, you know, associated with suffering. But here is also the normal in the sense of regaining a normal life, and also the joy of being together, taking care of each other's hair, learning a profession, in a sense also having a normal everyday life and trying to you know, move ahead in life. Now, Here, I just wanted to show that the normal curve, you've all had your statistics courses about the distribution of the normal curve around the mean. If you've got 2 standard deviations away from it, that normally only about 5% of the population falls outside of it. There are 2 forms of criticism on the normal curve. You know, if scholars use it, what does it say about conformity, pressure to conform to the mean, but also what happens beyond the 2 standard deviations? If you want to destroy your academic career, or if you want to have a really hard time, write about the normal curve, normal distribution, and then link it to issues of race or gender. Race happened, for example, in a book called The Bell Curve, now about 20 years old, about differences between African Americans and Caucasian Americans. Larry Summers once gave a speech about the lack of women in the study of physics. He referred to these curves. And well, he was president of Harvard University at the time. A few months later, he wasn't president any longer. Be very careful. Be aware that this kind of research, when people repeat research, they see changes over time or changes over culture. And here, the role of interpretation remains important. Think what I said earlier about crisis as a construct, crisis as an event, and crisis as a personal experience. If you do research, you will always have the topic that you choose, the constructs or the concepts that you work with, the choices that you make in collecting the data. There are always elements here, subjective elements here, that other people can criticize, and yeah, where you always need to have a critical awareness. Well, the 2 examples that I just gave about the bell curve and Larry Summers show how difficult and fraught these types of study can be. Now, let me now come to the penultimate part of my speech today. How does normalization take place in humanitarian action? I'm going to give you 3 examples. The first is a so-called core humanitarian standard. And I'm going to briefly introduce the core humanitarian standard to you. And I would like to discuss, although at the moment it would be more indicate, I would like to indicate, is this core humanitarian standard, to which extent does it acknowledge that the vulnerabilities have to do with power differences? Now, here's the core humanitarian standard. These are, for those of you who don't know humanitarian crisis, these are the 9 main commitments that humanitarian organizations should make to the communities and people affected by crisis. Of course, they should follow the humanitarian principles of humanity. You know, you help people in need because there are people wherever they may be found. Impartiality, you base yourself on need. Neutrality, you don't take sides in the conflict. And independence, those who give you money do not influence your actions. So if the US give money to the International Committee of the Red Cross, the US does not expect the ICRC to do its bidding. Now, the 9 standards. Humanitarian response is appropriate and relevant. Humanitarian response is effective and timely. Humanitarian response strengthens local capacities and avoids negative aspects. Well, it could be that the local capacities, negative effects, there is some awareness here of vulnerabilities. But there's also the idea that you can work with them. You can strengthen local capacities. You can avoid negative effects. Humanitarian response is based on communication, participation, and feedback. Complaints are welcomed and addressed. Humanitarian response is coordinated and complementary among the humanitarian organizations. Humanitarian actors continuously learn and improve. Wouldn't we all like to do that? Staff are supported to do their job effectively and are treated fairly and equitably. And the ninth one, resources are managed and used responsibly for their intended purpose. These are, you could say, pious wishes. You know, I've got nothing against them. The important problem is to which extent can they be realized, and to which extent does the core humanitarian standard explicitly recognize that vulnerabilities are always caused by power differences. If you read the core humanitarian standard, you will see that there are some issues that simply receive less attention. The competitions on humanitarian organizations, which can be fierce, it's only very implicitly addressed, you know, that we should be good for, that we should be responsible, that humanitarian organizations should be effective, efficient, timely. Those kind of terms are being used. But there is no head-on way of addressing the competition among humanitarian organizations. Similarly, the role of the donors, and I will, in my second example, I will go into that into more detail. And what actually causes the humanitarian crisis? The core humanitarian standard doesn't say anything about the causes of the humanitarian crisis, the causes of vulnerability, or if you want to, the causes of needs. So, the careful language of the core humanitarian standards has an implicitly suggests that voluntary behavior and equality with participants is possible. And that's a laudable normative ideal. By the way, I use the word normative here. Normal, associate these please with each other. But are those power relationships really that the people can express themselves, that the people can explain, that the people can express their needs? To which extent is this normative language a way to hide power relationships? And that may not be something that the organizations strive to do, but it may be an involuntary outcome. So the core humanitarian standard hides the actual power relationships so that the everyday normal of these power differences between humanitarian organizations that bring in food for people who are malnourished, or who bring shelter for people who don't have a roof above their head, so that these power differences disappear. Oh, I'm going too fast. Another concept that I would like to show you, and that's my second example, how crises are being normalized, is the so-called commodification of beneficiaries. The term came from Monica Krause, who wrote a book, a very good book about project management within humanitarian organizations. And the essential idea is that humanitarian organizations require funding. So how we, human beings, normally think about the requirement for funding is the humanitarian organizations will provide relief, and for that, of course, they will work with the beneficiaries to bring them this relief. The humanitarian organizations, however, have also a very important other relationship, and that's of course their relationship with the donor. And to provide aid to the beneficiaries, they need to sell the beneficiaries or the needs of the beneficiaries in such a way that the donor understands and the donor approves. So I remember how one PhD student of mine who had been working in Ethiopia, how she came back and she says, it's so funny. You know, I'm working with these managers and they've got both development projects and humanitarian projects. And they send these projects to different donors for money. And in the humanitarian projects, the people are in need. The people urgently require support. If they write development projects, the people can take the initiative. The people are maybe in a difficult situation, but they are making the best out of a bad situation. So there is a difference in the way humanitarian organizations, or I should say international organizations, sell development projects and humanitarian projects to the donors. This tells you something about the relationship between the humanitarian organization and the donor government. It actually tells you less about the actual relationship between the humanitarian organization and the beneficiaries. But what happens in this process is that the beneficiaries lose voice. It's, for example, the humanitarian organization or the donor that determines how much money will be available and in which ways it will be spent. So this commodification of beneficiaries to sell them to the donor so that the donor can approve money and or more generally provide funding is also a form of veiled institutionalized power. Most people, if you want to get funding, they will not problematize it in their funding applications, because if the donor disagrees with you, you will not get any money. So it's a rarely analyzed form of normality in donor, humanitarian organization, beneficiary relationships. It's not that it's actually completely hidden. You know, it's not complete ignorance. It's more a known unknown where people don't speak about it, or a public secret. Donors can be critical about it when you speak with them. Humanitarian organizations can be critical about them. Beneficiaries don't always know about the interaction between the donors and the humanitarian organizations, but they notice how that actually influences their aid or the aid that they receive, and that they do not have much voice or accountability, that there's not much downward accountability in that relationship. So it's not ignorance. If it's ignorance, it's willful ignorance. It's people who decide not to speak about the problems in this aid chain, in this donor humanitarian beneficiary relationship. It's more a public secret that people don't talk about. Just as the language in my first example stresses the possibility of equality between participants, beneficiaries, and the humanitarian organizations. Now I'm going to come to my last example, and it's also the most complicated one. Malnutrition is hard to measure, yeah, and generally needs are not always easy to measure. For example, malnutrition is seasonal. So if in South Sudan you mention in July, there will always be malnutrition, sometimes a famine. If you mention it, or if you measure it in October, harvest has just come in, chances that you will find malnutrition are much, much smaller. There are, if you want to do research on malnutrition or identifying needs in general, there are all kinds of access, partly because there's a war going on, partly because of long distances, partly because of the rain period, all kinds of access issues, and there are all kinds of sampling issues. When people are not easy to reach, how do you do your sampling? Now, people have specific techniques, so as mid-upper arm circumference. I hope you know mid-upper arm circumference. It's a way to measure the muscles, the size of the muscles of the upper arm, And if you've got wasting, so if muscles are disappearing, that's an indication, of course, of malnutrition or of famine. Now, the nutritional experts will always tell you, MUAC, it's okay as an indicator, but we need more indicators. For example, weight for height is an important one, because then you can also compare with age and weight. And so there are several measures that people make in trying to understand malnutrition or trying to understand famine. At the same time, it's important for the organizations to come up with this data, because if they've got this data, they've got better chances to receive funding from the donors. Yet, and this is something that is always painful to say, children in Europe or in the US have different standards on malnutrition than children in Africa. And the children in Africa generally are assumed to be able to consume less calories. So I repeat it, they are assumed to be able to deal with less calories than European or US kids. Now, one author who's done a really good book on this quantification of needs is Joël Klasman in Humanitarianism and the Quantification of Human Needs, and he called, the subtitle was Minimal Humanity. There are 3 steps, and this is a bit complicated, but you need to keep in mind one thing. OCHA, that's the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, it needs to provide information to donors on the specific situation, the specific humanitarian crisis. So it needs to describe the humanitarian crisis to donor governments. So it needs to provide numbers on needs and vulnerability. And at the same time, it needs to diminish competition among humanitarian organizations so that they agree that OCHA, can provide that information to donors. So how did OCHA go about it? It placed humanitarian organizations in 10 sectors, such as food, security, WASH, that's water and sanitation and hygiene, health, shelter, and so on. Now, each sector, which is being led by a UN organization, for example, FAO in food security, selects 3 to 5 indicators for each sector. Yeah, that's the first step. These indicators then need to be weighed for each sector in a specific district where the humanitarian crisis can take or is taking place, or where they want information to check whether the humanitarian crisis is taking place. Now, these indicators are then normalized from 0 to 1, and they are expressed as a percentage of the maximum score, with 0 for a normal situation, no famine, no humanitarian crisis, and 1 for the most serious situations, many people are dying. Then the overall nutritional indicator is the arithmetic average of these 3 indicators. So let's assume we've got the nutrition indicator 1 is 1.6, nutrition indicator 2 is 0.4, nutrition indicator 3 is 0.5. So we've got 3 indicators. Together, the total value of 0.6 plus 0.4 plus 0.5 is 1.5. You divide it by 3. The nutrition indicator is then 0.5. Now the most delicate step, and the last step comes. To construct a general score for each district that represents all the needs of the entire district population in every sector, so you could call that its vulnerability, and without alienating the humanitarian organizations that were involved in the different sectors, OCHA software then computed the geographical average of the indicators of all 10 sectors. So you get a general score about the health indicator, the education indicator, the nutrition indicator, until the 10th sector indicator, and then you divide it by 10. So each sector has an equal part in the general score I should have written. This was not based, by the way, on public health, but to create formal equality among the sectors to avoid competition and conflict among the different humanitarian organizations and the different sector. So this was like an implicit consensus, not based on public health data, but in the end, well, it's based on the collection of public health data, but the arithmetics of the general score are just a form of aggregating data that prevents competition among humanitarian organizations. Most of the humanitarian workers are not epidemiologists or nutritionists. So they cooperate with OCHA. People at the local level who collect the data, the epidemiologists or the nutritional scholars, often discuss the methodological shortcomings, but this gets lost in the aggregation or the presentation of these scores at the global level. Yeah, please, this is actually kind of complicated, but I hope that you understand that there's a process of aggregating data, not based on public health, but based on habits, based on, you could call it the arithmetic, you could call it a logarithm, to provide an outcome that's then being transmitted to donors so that they can provide money, or the media so that they can see that the situation is serious. But there is an element that's not a public health element, but that is a competition element among the humanitarian organizations. And the numbers that you get, the scores that you see, do not tell you about the power differences among the humanitarian organizations, but also among local actors, for example, corruptions, or other factors that cause these needs or vulnerabilities or crises. So in a sense, you could say that the software of OCHA has a life of its own. And these numbers then leave out the important institutional analysis of power relationships among the humanitarian organizations or with all kinds of local actors. Now, that's not ignorance, although not everybody will understand, you know, these complicated way of coming up with scores. Many people know that they are not perfect, but at the moment that time comes to act or to provide information to the media, okay, this is imperfect information, it may be the best we've got, or we even don't speak about it and we just keep it a public secret, so that we at least can continue with our work, so that OCHA can continue to coordinate, so that the nutrition organizations can provide nutritional support to, for example, malnourished children. So now I'm coming to the conclusion. I've given you a very broad tour, tour d'horizon, of ways in which people try to define a crisis. Don't do that perfectly, or sometimes, you know, it's an elusive target to define the crisis. How then? There is a shift in power, experts take over, and in the way that you provide aid, or in the way that you define a crisis or an indicator, that hides to some extent, for example, competition among humanitarian agencies, but also how you show an indicator, always has a certain power relationship behind it that's not always noted. So you should always come up with the question, who does the aiding, the defining, and if you want to, the hiding or the showing. But what happens if when people see these numbers, that is what for them starts counting as a crisis. In this sense, the crisis becomes normal. Yeah. And that brings us back to the earlier issue that the crisis is both a construct and a material event. Only when I talked about Kevin Carter, I talked about the personal experience. And I've left the personal experience mainly out of my speech today. Yeah, but a crisis is both a construct and a material event, and understanding how these interact, and you could call that a reflective approach, is really important, because I think you as scholars would really like to understand, why people call something a crisis or behave in a certain way during a crisis. Why does a humanitarian organization obtain funding? How does it obtain funding? And what does it do with this funding? In a reflective approach, you try to address the constructs that people use, be it a normal curve, be it the equations that I've just showed you. But you try also to criticize it, to understand how people came up with these equations, how people came up with these constructs. The problem, and this is something that each scholar has to do for him or herself, is that I cannot tell you what in your case would be when you're discussing a crisis or studying people influenced by a crisis, how much of a, you need to have the discussion of the construct, the critical review of the construct, and the more positivist way of, for example, collecting data on malnutrition, on the number of refugees. Quite often you will notice that the way in which data is being presented, that it's not so much ignorance, but it's what I earlier called there are known unknowns in it, or public secrets, where people don't speak about it because at least that keeps the system functioning, system going. Another term that people sometimes use for that is a working misunderstanding. Now, be critical, therefore, of norms, normative, and normal. They are concepts that reveal, that can hide and reveal, often simultaneously. They have their own consequences.